I think he enjoyed singing that. So we're in a new month now. Happy July. July, our theme for the month is open communication. So open communication, I thought, what in the world? Why did they give me this theme to talk about? But you know, we're looking at our freedom this month. And as we look at how we're free, how are we communicating with one another? And do we communicate in open ways? Are we looking at what life has for us and being open to all the diversity, to all the change that goes on within our country, within our state, within our own brains and lives? So, e pluribus unum. I never did do Latin well. The strength of the United States is in our diversity. And so that's where I want to look at today. Out of many, one. That's what e pluribus unum means. Out of many, one. And there are so many different ways to look at this. The talk today is a multicultural America. And so as America changes its face, how open are we to communicating, to understanding, to living and loving everything that's going on? I saw this wonderful video last year, and I thought about playing it, but I think there was something in it that said 2016, and I figured you'd tell me I was living in the past. It was John Sienna. My son knows him, I didn't. And he's talking about America and how America has changed. And so in the video, he invites us to close our eyes, to think about, bring into your mind the typical American. And he's walking through the streets of this town in the video. And as he talks about each of the different things, you see those people in the background. And it was just so cool the way this happened. And he talks about everything from people with handicaps, to people that speak other languages, to people that have other religions than what might be ours. And one of the big things that struck me, he said, in your mind, what have you pictured for the typical American? Because the typical American is a woman. Well, that shot a bunch of people's idea, didn't it? And the typical American was not a white person. Woo! Okay, that's out the window now. And so it was so neat as we looked, and he's talking about how America is changing and how we embrace all of these people. America was built on immigration. Unless you were an American Indian, you're not native. Your family was not native. There's a wake-up call for some people. So, can we embrace changes in life? And can we see how out of many, we are one? One humankind. I saw a bumper sticker yesterday, and I loved it because it said, humankind, be both. I thought, I followed that car for quite a while, and I thought, I really like that. That really says something, doesn't it? So when we think of out of many, one, I think of different analogies here. So a quilt comes to mind, because you take all these different pieces of material in the quilt, you sew them together, and you have one covering. And the design is beautiful, isn't it? I don't know that I've seen an ugly quilt. I've seen some that I wished had more color, but I've never seen an ugly one. Because when they come together, it's really neat. If you don't like that analogy, try the box of crayons. Because you have all these colors in the box of crayons, right? And when you draw or color a picture, you use more than one color most of the time. So when you add all of that diversity, what a beautiful picture you can create. And my favorite, a stained glass window. You take all these different sizes, shapes, colors of glass, and you put them together, and you can create a magnificent window. Out of many, one. So you see how we come together, all different cultures, all different religions, all different ways of being in the world. And together as America, we come together much stronger. The United States, we're stronger together than we are as one individual state. So I hope that you recognize that from many, we can have a great one. In Science of Mind, one of our main principles here is oneness. And so it goes very well with this talk. Probably because I'm talking about science of mind, right? And here we talk about oneness. Ernest Holmes in our textbook says, "This is the perception that Buddha, Jesus, and other great leaders, spiritual leaders had. They understood that the universe has to be one in order to be at all." When you look at nature, you see all kinds of different expressions of spirit. Well, at least I do. Last Sunday, Tom got our bikes ready. He pumped up the tires and got the seats all set, and when I came home from church, he was ready to go for a bike ride. How fun was that? So I've been riding my bike this week, and I've discovered this whole prairie dog community. I don't know what you all call it, but I call them prairie dogs. And they're wonderful. And I see them, perked up looking. And so now it's a real joy because I have to ride a little further to get to the prairie dog community. But it's fun to see that. And all the birds that are swooping around and sitting in the trees calling out. Nature is everywhere, and I see that all as an expression of God. Then there's different people that you pass on the trail. And some people are very friendly. And I'm learning in Colorado, you always say, "on the left." Which I learned, you never tell them what you don't want them to do. So if you leave left in their brain, they're going to step to the left. But I heard that's not bike etiquette. So I'm learning. I haven't quite gotten there. I usually will say, "I'm coming up behind you, don't want to scare you," and people will say thank you. Some people just give you a look. Most of them, though, will say thank you. And so, how do you show up in the world? There are all these different people. There's all these different birds. There's prairie dogs. There was even a little snake on the path. It made me pedal faster. But when we see this diversity, can we embrace it? Can we love it? Can we say, yes, that makes my life richer to experience this? I hope so. Because in all of that diversity, there's a oneness. And that oneness is spirit. It's God. It's the divine intelligence that's living in and through everything around us. And that, to me, is very exciting. So my question today, as we celebrate the 4th of July, and we celebrate the freedom of our nation, where and how do you celebrate your freedom? Does your freedom keep somebody else from having their freedom? Does your freedom keep somebody else from having their freedom? Ernest Holmes, our founder, said, "The will of God for any of us is that we have more life, more expansive experience of life and joy. And it's fine as long as it does not harm anyone else." So what do you do that might harm someone else? We talk at Centers for Spiritual Living that we want a world that works for everyone. Well, what does that really mean, a world that works for everyone? We have to expand our thinking. We've got to get outside of ourselves to understand what that really means. I'll share a story with you that years ago, I worked as a director of a home health agency. And in our home health agency, I needed an occupational therapist. And we could not find anyone with those credentials. And so I went through a headhunter, and they located me an occupational therapist. I was in a hospital in southern Indiana, the United States. The occupational therapist was in South Africa. We did phone interviews. First time I had done phone interviews rather than a face-to-face. New experience. She sounded very English with this accent. So I had no idea what I was getting except this English-sounding lady. And when she and her husband and her 5-year-old arrived, it was 3 days before the Kentucky Derby celebration. And we celebrated the Kentucky Derby. We lived in Kentucky. I was working in southern Indiana. It's right across the river. Kentucky Derby is every Kentuckian's excuse to drink for a week. And we had fun. And I thought, how wonderful, because this family is going to be here 3 days before this festival. They're going to get to take part in all of this stuff. They'll get to see the air show. They'll get to see the fireworks. I had them staying in a hotel right on the river, and they bring barges into the river, and that's where they shoot the fireworks off from. This is going to be wonderful. I didn't know too much, because this world that works for everyone didn't work for them. The 5-year-old was frightened by the air show, because in his experience, those planes that came in and made noise, he thought was somebody coming to bomb their village. And that was his experience. It broke my heart. The fireworks that I so much enjoyed, the booming and everything, scared him. He was hiding under the bed because he was afraid of what that meant, that there was some kind of war going on, that he was in danger. And my heart went out because I thought, wow, I never thought of this. So we say we want a world that works for everyone, but the open communication, the understanding what other people have been through is very important for us to do. I had somebody from here in our congregation talking to me this week about how she had gone out and she was going through this door, and a family that was coming in must have been Muslim. The woman was wearing her headgear. And so this person said, I always try to make eye contact. And so she looked at the woman, and the woman looked back into her eyes, and there was a connection there. Sometimes we don't have to sit down and say, tell me all about yourself. But it's with our eyes, it's with our hearts open in compassion that we can create that connection between people. We were at a restaurant this week, and I saw this young man with a t-shirt on, and the t-shirt had a Hindu symbol on it. And I was immediately drawn to him, and I thought, I really would love to go over and sit down at his table and say, tell me about your shirt, tell me about yourself. And then I thought, sure as I do, he'll say, oh, I got this at Goodwill. I don't know what this means. But are we open, really open to hearing other people's story? And that's important for everything that we do. Another major principle in science of mind is that of love. What is the most loving thing that you can do for others? I would say it begins with listening to them. Listen to them and understand their needs and their views. Communicate openly with them. Share what you don't understand. And be willing to learn. I have, through the years, said many things to people that were different than me out of my ignorance. To say, I have learned, to say I am colorblind is not a good thing. I might think I'm being high and mighty, but you know what? If I can't recognize that this person is different from me, then I'm not recognizing the culture behind that. When I was the director of a hospice, I had a very difficult time at first because when I had African American patients and they had lost their loved one, they would throw themselves on the ground. They would lay across the cars, run outside and lay across the cars, and all of this chaos going on. Well, me and my little white world wanted to control this. You know, we shouldn't have this stuff going on. It was fine. That's how they needed to grieve. And could I be open to allowing people to grieve differently than I do? I hope so. I learned a lot about allowing people to be where they are and letting them experience life how they need to experience it. That's a world that works for everyone. When I'm not trying to impose my views on somebody else, my ways on someone else. So, listening, open communication, and understanding that this might be something that's important to someone else. The whole question here is, do you see the oneness with the other person? Do you see the oneness with nature? Or do you see yourself as separate from that? Sit with that question this week. Do you see yourself as one with all that are around you? Or do you see yourself as separate? Tom and I love to go out for breakfast. And we had our favorite little breakfast spot in Florida called Mom's. Mom's was great. And I've not found a place like that here. If you know one, let me know. One of the things that we loved about Mom's was that the waitresses were all so friendly. And what we learned was that they shared their tips. And I haven't found many restaurants that do this. The waitresses all shared tips. When they got a tip, it went into the jar, and at the end of the day, they divided the jar equally among all of them. So it was up to everyone to help in the restaurant. Somebody would be coming by our table, and they would say, "Let me take that plate for you." Somebody else would be walking around serving their customers coffee, and they'd come over and pour coffee for us. Anytime they walk by, "Do you need anything?" It's like, "Well, you're not our waitress." That didn't matter. They were there to help everybody have a good experience. Now, these waitresses were very different. We had the older ones, we had the younger ones. We had the one with a very heavy Boston accent who had to watch the Red Sox on TV while she was working. And we had the one from Ireland. We had the English. We had the Mexicans. There was all this diversity among the waitresses, and they got along so well because they were all coming together for one purpose: to serve their customers and to have a good experience and to make their tips. Now, we talked to a waitress here about that, and we were sharing that experience, and she said, "Oh, well, you know, we've got a few people here that don't pull their weight, so I would never want to share tips because that would take away from my tips." Do you hear the attitude? What if we could all work together and everybody would get more tips? Because you know what? That's going to be a better experience for all the customers. So how do we move through life? Do we move through life loving one another? Sharing? And if somebody's having a bad day and they look really down, that we can be able to raise them up? If we step outside of our comfort zone, if we listen, if we work with people, they'll work with us. What we give out, we're going to get back. Will you share your tips in life? Or will you hoard yours because somebody else may not pull their own weight? It's really more about how we respond to life than about having everything work out just perfectly. Have you ever gone on vacation and had bad weather? You can't really do anything about it, can you? What you can do is decide to have a different mental attitude. Accept it. Find the blessing in whatever's going on. Maybe the fact that it's raining and you're at the beach, you get to play board games. You get to do something that you hadn't planned to do, and it brings you together with your friends, with your family. It's our choice how we're going to respond to life. Tom and I came here to Colorado 14 years ago on vacation. We were visiting some friends of ours who had moved to Breckenridge. We got there, we had a good time. Toward the end of the week, our friend was hoping it would snow. She was doing Reiki treatments, trying to get it to snow. This was 14 years ago, and in case you can't remember, that was the year they had 7 foot of snow in Breckenridge. And probably down here you had a good bit too, because the interstate was closed for 3 days. The roof of the airport in Denver collapsed, part of it did, and they closed the airport for 3 days. Guess who couldn't go home to take his son to the airport to fly because he was moving to Japan? I'm still traumatized by that. So we stayed in Breckenridge. We couldn't get off the mountain. And guess what? I got to take a downhill ski lesson. We got to go snowshoeing. I got to see the excitement and the love for the people that were so thrilled because here's 7 foot of fresh powder. Woo! They're ready. I could have said, oh, I've got to stay here and I really need to go home, and what am I going to do, and who's going to take my son to the airport? Or I could choose to say, wow, what's the blessing here? I have 2 women that are staying with my dogs. They'll take my son to the airport for me. All is not lost. This was before the days of Uber. Now he'd be calling Uber. Ernest Holmes said, "We have thought that outside things controlled us, when all the time we had within us that which could have changed everything and given us freedom from bondage." One of my favorite quotes from Ernest is that we're bound by nothing except our belief. Do we believe that we are one with all that is? Or do we believe that we're separate? And in that separateness, that we have to fight and struggle against life. It's our choice. I've heard a quote, I don't know who said it. We can make life a bed of roses or a path of thorns. It's all in our attitude and how we want to look at life. Another way Ernest explained this is, even the Spirit, which does not seek to control us, lets us alone to discover ourselves. So even God is not trying to control us. We have free will. We get to choose. How do we want to respond to life? How do we want to show up in life? Do we want to see ourselves as one, share the tips, or do we want to be separate? It's our choice. It really is our choice. And as America becomes more and more multicultural, do we see ourselves as one with all, even though people look different than us, might speak different than us, might worship different than us? I love that we honor all paths to God. Because you know, the woman that wears the hijab, the headgear, the Muslim woman, that takes some chutzpah to be able to go out in public and do this and say, this is who I am, this is my faith. The Muslim that will get on the floor and pray 5 times a day, do you have that passion for your religion? Then don't be telling somebody else that they're wrong. Because we embrace it all. I love the passion that people have for their religion, for their love of God. and how they can express that. And you know, we get to express it in our way too. What is it that we want to do? If we feel ourselves segregated, segregation will only lead to violence. And violence comes when we forget who we are, when we forget that we are one. At CSL Parker, we say, peace is our sole purpose. So how do we live peace in the world? How do we bring peace into our lives and share that with others? The Declaration of Independence. Phil read that earlier today, a section of that. And it's been a slow journey and process. For the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. Well, let me just fill you in. In 1770s, when this was written, all men meant if you were white and a landowner, then you're created equal. So the slow process of our country coming through the years has been that all men has been able to change, to include African Americans as equal, to include women as equal, to include people with different sexual orientations as equal. And all of these groups have also found that there are people that don't see them as equal. You see, the laws can change, but it's what's inside of us that matters. How we live our lives, what we embrace, the mentality we embrace is what really matters of how we show up in the world. I want to end with a story that talks about the sage in India. The sage was a very devout man, and every morning he would go into the river Ganges, completely into the river to pray. He prayed not only for himself, for his family, for his town, he prayed for the world and the peace that could come to the world. And then he would leave the river. Well, one morning as he was leaving the river at the end of his prayers, he saw this poisonous spider that was struggling. And so he cupped his hands. He lifted the spider up and carried it on the shore. And when he put the spider down, it stung him. Because he had been so devout in his prayers, the poison was diluted in his body, and it didn't affect him. The next day, he went back and prayed in the river. And when he was coming out of the river, he saw the same spider. He cupped his hands and picked the spider up, took it to the shore, and when he put it down, the spider stung him again. The third day, he was coming up out of the river after his prayers, and there was the spider. And he went to cup his hands to pick it up, and the spider said, "Why do you keep lifting me up? I'm only going to sting you, because that is what I do." And the sage cupped his hands, picked him up, carried him to the shore, and said, as he put him down, "Because this is what I do." How are you going to show up in life? If somebody stings you once, do you stop trusting people? Do you see yourself as separate? Or do you allow yourself to feel the oneness that's there? Do you have a heart of compassion? Because that's the only way they know to live, to show up. And there's so much more that they could be. What is it that you do? Because that is what you do. I want to end with a prayer that Ernest Holmes wrote called A Prayer for My Country. And this was in the Science of Mind magazine, July 1953, just a few years ago. So pray with me. believing in the divine destiny of the United States of America, and in the preservation of liberty, security, and self-expression for all, I offer this my prayer for my country. I know that divine intelligence governs the destiny of the United States of America, directing the thought and activity of all who guide its affairs. I know that success, prosperity, and happiness are the gifts of freedom and the divine heritage of everyone in this country, that they are now operating in the affairs of every individual in this country. I know that divine guidance enlightens the collective mind of the people of this country, causing it to know the economic security and that it may come to all without loss of either personal freedom or individual self-expression. I know that no one can believe or be led to believe that personal freedom must be surrendered in order to ensure economic security for all. The all-knowing mind contains the answer to every problem which confronts this country. I know that every leader in this country is now directed by its all-knowing mind and has the knowledge of complete solution to every problem. Each is impelled to act upon this knowledge to the end that abundance, security, and peace shall come to all. And I know that this spiritual democracy shall endure, guaranteeing to everyone in this country personal liberty, happiness, and self-expression. And so it is.